On a moonless night in October 1963, a small boat slipped out of a cove on the coast of South Vietnam and headed north across the demilitarized zone. On board were 6 South Vietnamese men in black clothing carrying American weapons and American radio equipment, trained at an American facility, briefed by American officers, and inserted on a mission that the American government would spend the next 30 years officially denying had ever taken place. Their mission was to infiltrate North Vietnam, establish a resistance network, gather intelligence, and report back. They were told that resupply flights would come. They were told that if they were captured, the United States would work to secure their release. They were told they were not being abandoned. Every one of those promises was false. Within 72 hours, the 6 men had been captured by North Vietnamese security forces. They were interrogated, imprisoned, and sentenced to terms that in several cases exceeded 20 years. The resupply flights never came because there was no network to supply. The diplomatic efforts to secure their release never materialized because the American government had no official knowledge of their existence. Their own government in Saigon listed them as deserters. Their families received no information, no support, and no acknowledgement that their sons and husbands had been sent on a mission from which return was never genuinely expected. They were not the first. They were not the last. Between 1961 and 1968, the United States government, operating through the Central Intelligence Agency and later through the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, known as MACVISOG, sent hundreds of South Vietnamese men on covert infiltration missions into North Vietnam. They went by air and by sea. They were dropped by parachute into remote mountain areas. They were landed by boat on isolated beaches. They were trained, equipped, briefed, and inserted with the full knowledge of senior American officials. And they were, in a proportion that was recognized early and documented carefully in classified reports that were then buried, almost universally captured or killed within days of insertion. The program that produced these missions had its origins in the earliest days of American involvement in Vietnam. In 1954, after the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the CIA began exploring the possibility of establishing stay-behind networks in the North, resistance cells that could gather intelligence and conduct sabotage if North Vietnam moved aggressively against the South. Edward Lansdale, the legendary CIA officer who had played a central role in the Philippine government's defeat of the Huk insurgency, was sent to Saigon to develop the program. Lansdale and his team recruited South Vietnamese agents, trained them, and sent them north in the period immediately following the partition, when movement between North and South was still somewhat possible under the terms of the Accords. The early operations were modestly successful by the standards of covert intelligence work. Some agents were inserted, some networks were established, some intelligence was gathered, but as North Vietnam's security apparatus consolidated control after 1956, the environment for agent operations became dramatically more hostile. The North Vietnamese security services, trained and advised by Soviet and East German intelligence professionals, were thorough, methodical, and ruthless. They penetrated networks, turned agents, and created elaborate deceptions that fed false intelligence back to the CIA while rolling up the actual agent networks one by one. By the early 1960s, the CIA's classified internal assessments of the agent program were deeply pessimistic. The networks were being penetrated. The agents were being captured. The intelligence being reported by the few agents who remained in contact was of uncertain reliability because there was no way to determine which sources had been compromised and turned. But rather than shut down the program, the Kennedy administration decided to expand it. The expansion was driven by a logic that was straightforward on paper and catastrophic in practice. North Vietnam was supporting the insurgency in the South through the Ho Chi Minh Trail and through a network of political and military infrastructure that extended into every province of South Vietnam. Disrupting that infrastructure required intelligence about North Vietnamese plans, capabilities, and decision-making. Conventional means of intelligence collection, aerial reconnaissance, signals intercept, prisoner interrogation could not provide the kind of granular human intelligence that only agents inside North Vietnam could supply. Therefore, the agent program had to continue and had to grow, even if the current results were poor, because the alternative was operating blind. This logic was reinforced by optimism that was not supported by the evidence. Each new class of agents was better trained than the last, the argument went. Each new insertion method was more sophisticated. Each new cover story was more carefully constructed. The failures were attributed to the specific vulnerabilities of previous operations rather than to the fundamental impossibility of inserting South Vietnamese agents into a police state with an extremely effective security service that was specifically looking for them. The people making these arguments were not stupid. They were operating under institutional pressures that made failure difficult to acknowledge and made optimism professionally rewarding. The program formally expanded under National Security Action Memorandum 57, signed by President Kennedy in June 1961, and accelerated further under the operational plan known as OPLAN 34A, which President Johnson approved in January 1964 following the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. OPLAN 34A transferred primary operational control of the agent program from the CIA to MACFASOG, a hybrid military intelligence organization that reported directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. MACFASOG was given responsibility for a range of covert operations against North Vietnam, including psychological warfare, maritime sabotage, and the agent insertion program that had been running since the late 1950s. The agents recruited for these missions came from several sources. Some were South Vietnamese military personnel, particularly members of the airborne and ranger units who had demonstrated aptitude for unconventional operations. Some were ethnic minorities from the highland regions, particularly Montagnard and Nung fighters who had experience operating in remote terrain. Some were North Vietnamese refugees who had moved south after the 1954 partition and who had family connections or local knowledge in specific northern provinces that made them potentially useful for particular missions. All of them went through training programs at facilities in South Vietnam and, in some cases, at sites in other countries. The training was professional and thorough by the standards of the time. Agents learned communications procedures, including the use of the specific one-time pad cipher systems that were supposed to make their radio transmissions secure. They learned how to construct cover identities, how to survive off the land, how to conduct surveillance and counter-surveillance, how to cache weapons and supplies, and how to recruit local contacts. The Americans who trained them were, in many cases, genuinely skilled professionals who believed in what they were doing and who invested real effort in preparing their trainees for what lay ahead. What lay ahead was capture. The classified records that were eventually reviewed by the Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs in the early 1990s told a story that was, in retrospect, visible in the operational data almost from the beginning of the expanded program. Of the agents inserted into North Vietnam under the various programs that preceded and followed OPLAN 34A, the capture rate was catastrophic. Some estimates based on the classified after-action assessments that MACFASOG prepared suggested that as many as 90% of agents inserted into North Vietnam were captured within weeks of their arrival. The capture rate was not a random product of operational misfortune. The North Vietnamese security apparatus had several systematic advantages that made the program's failure essentially inevitable. First, North Vietnam was a totalitarian state with a highly developed system of population control. Every village had its committee, every neighborhood had its watch, every stranger's presence was noted and reported. A South Vietnamese agent trying to blend into a northern village faced a surveillance environment that was fundamentally different from anything he had encountered in his training. The cover stories and false identities that might have worked in a less controlled environment were transparently inadequate against a system that tracked every person's movements, work history, and social connections in meticulous detail. Second, the North Vietnamese security services had penetrated the program at a level that American analysts were slow to acknowledge. Turned agents were providing information about insertion methods, cover story formats, communications procedures, and the identities of case officers. Some of the intelligence that MACFASOG was receiving from agents still ostensibly in the field was being fed by the North Vietnamese themselves, who had captured the agents, turned them, and were now running them back against the Americans in a controlled operation. The Americans were in some cases paying for intelligence that the North Vietnamese were manufacturing specifically for them. Third, and perhaps most damning, there is evidence in the classified record that American officials knew the capture rate was catastrophic and continued the program anyway. A 1964 CIA assessment reviewed by the Senate committee concluded that virtually all of the agent teams inserted into North Vietnam had been compromised. The assessment recommended significant changes to the program, including the possibility of suspending insertions until the security situation could be better understood. The recommendation was not implemented. OPLAN 34A continued. New agents were trained. New teams were inserted. New men were captured. The men who were captured were imprisoned in North Vietnamese facilities that were separate from the camps where American pilots and other military prisoners were held. They were not acknowledged as prisoners of war because their missions had never been officially acknowledged. They occupied a legal and institutional void. They were not American citizens, so the American government had no formal obligation to seek their release through diplomatic channels. They were not recognized as combatants by North Vietnam, which treated them as spies and criminals rather than prisoners of war. They were not acknowledged by their own government in Saigon, which had listed them as deserters or as missing in circumstances that provided no basis for official inquiry. Some of these men spent 20 years or more in North Vietnamese prisons. The conditions were brutal. Former prisoners who were eventually repatriated described prolonged interrogation, physical abuse, inadequate food and medical care, and years of solitary confinement. Unlike the American pilots held in Hanoi, they had no organizational structure, no senior officer to provide guidance, no tap code through concrete walls, no contact with the outside world that might suggest their situation was known or that anyone was working toward their release. They were truly alone. The families of these men in South Vietnam received nothing. No official notification that their relative had been on a classified mission, no information about whether he was alive or dead, no financial support, no acknowledgement. Wives raised children without knowing whether their husbands were imprisoned in the north, dead in the jungle, or had genuinely deserted as the official paperwork suggested. The stigma of the deserter designation attached to the families. In South Vietnamese military culture, having a deserter in the family carried significant social consequences. Women who had sent their husbands off on secret missions for the government found themselves treated as the families of men who had run away. After 1975, when North Vietnam took control of the entire country, some of the imprisoned agents were released. They emerged into a reunified Vietnam in which they were regarded as enemies of the state who had collaborated with American imperialism. The men who had been captured trying to serve the American war effort found themselves in a country that considered them criminals. Some were subjected to re-education programs. Some fled as part of the boat people exodus of the late 1970s and 1980s. Some remained in Vietnam and lived in obscurity, unable to speak about what they had done or what had been done to them. The American reckoning with the program, such as it was, came in the early 1990s through the work of the Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs, chaired by Senator John Kerry and co-chaired by Senator Bob Smith. The committee was established primarily to investigate the broader question of whether American prisoners had been left behind in Vietnam after the 1973 prisoner release, but its investigators encountered the agent program in the course of their research and pursued it. The classified documents they reviewed, combined with testimony from former MACFOG personnel and from the men who had actually been inserted and survived, produced a picture that was damning in its clarity. The committee's final report, published in 1993, concluded that the agent program had been a near-total operational failure, that American officials had known early that the failure rate was catastrophic and had continued the program anyway, that the families of captured and killed agents had been abandoned without support or information, and that the agents themselves had been treated as expendable in a way that the committee found deeply troubling. The report recommended that the United States government make some form of compensation available to surviving agents and to the families of those who had died or remained missing. The recommendation was not implemented in any comprehensive way. Some individual cases were addressed through informal channels. The broader population of men who had served in the program and their families received nothing systematic. Sedgwick Torreson, a former Army intelligence officer who spent years researching the program and published a book about it in 1995, estimated that the total number of men inserted into North Vietnam under the various programs was in the hundreds, possibly exceeding 500 when all phases of the operation were included. He concluded that the survival rate, defined as men who were inserted and returned to South Vietnamese control without being captured, was in the single digits as a percentage. Some former MACFOG personnel disputed those numbers. None disputed that the program had failed catastrophically or that the men who served in it had been abandoned. The 6 men who left on that boat in October 1963 were among the earliest casualties of a program that continued for years after their capture, had demonstrated its fundamental impossibility. Some of them eventually made it to the United States after years of imprisonment and subsequent refugee processing. They arrived old, damaged, and carrying decades of experience that no one in America had any framework for understanding. They had been sent on missions their government denied, captured in a country their government was not officially at war with, imprisoned for years in conditions their government could not acknowledge, and released into a world that had moved on entirely from the war that had consumed their lives. They asked for nothing dramatic. They asked to be acknowledged. They asked for someone to say, officially and clearly, that they had been sent, that what had been asked of them was known, and that what had happened to them was understood. That acknowledgement, in any complete and official form, has never come. The program that sent them north is documented now in declassified files and Senate reports and the books of researchers who spent years piecing together what happened. But documentation is not acknowledgement. A file in the National Archives is not an apology, and the men who went north on one-way missions into a police state, on the word of officers who knew the odds and sent them anyway, deserved more than a file. There is a video on screen right now that goes deeper into the covert operations America conducted and concealed during the Vietnam War. And if this story left you with something heavy, that is the correct response. Subscribe. The men who were sent and forgotten are still waiting to be remembered.